Hey, hello students. This is Dr. Lyons again. And in this chapter, chapter 13 that is, we're going to talk about what it's like for things to live on the continental shelf. Specifically, we're going to talk about kelp forests because this is a kind of interesting habitat that we have on continental shelves here on our coastline in California. So this is, of course, what a kelp forest looks like. And so we're going to talk about what it's like to live in there, and we're going to talk a little bit about the ecology of those areas. So first, a little bit about kelp, right? So kelp is brown algae, right? We learned back in chapter 5 or maybe it was 6, I should say, that algae includes brown, green, and red. And brown algae, what are known as the Phaeophyta, are the group that includes the kelps. So brown algae includes like sargassum, what's known as padina, and then all of these different types of kelps. So brown algae, in particular kelps, typically are found in cold water. And why they are brown is because they have this pigment known as fucoxanthin. Right, so we learned back in that chapter about how plants and algae and microscopic plants, phytoplankton that is, we learned about how these things all have photosynthetic pigments in them that they use in order to absorb sunlight and to photosynthesize. So fucoxanthin is the brown pigment that brown algae use to get sunlight, and it's what gives them a brownish color. Okay, as a refresher, the parts of a kelp that we talked about, right? So first, the holdfast, that is this thing down here that holds the kelp onto the sea floor. The stipe is the long stem-like part, so that would be this on this one, or this long stem-like thing there. The nematocysts are the air pockets that hold it up into the water. So like that right there, that right there, that right there. Those little bulbs are the nematocysts. And finally, the blades are the leaf-like parts. So these are the blades of this one. And then like this flat thing there, and then this like flat thing there. Those are the blades of that kelp there. So there's kind of two big kelps that we have on the west coast here. So we have what are known as macrocystis, the giant kelp, which can be over 30 meters, so over roughly 100 feet. And these are the things that form really big forests. And then we have what are known as nereocystis, which are the bullwhip kelp. So macrocystis is the one that has really kind of thin stipes in many nematocysts and many blades. Whereas Nereocystis, the bullwhip kelp, has one kind of thicker stipe. It has just one nematocyst at the top and then a set of blades at the top. Right, so that's how the two are different. So Macrocystis giant kelp has many blades, many nematocysts in a thin stipe, whereas Nereocystis has a thicker stipe, just one nematocyst, and then blades only at the top. So we've talked a lot about zonation in the intertidal zone. We talked a little bit about zonation in salt marshes as well. It turns out that there is zonation inside of kelp forests as well. So as you go from shallower to deeper, you tend to find different sets of kelp, right? So close to the intertidal area, you find feather boa kelp. Then you get into what's known as laminaria types of kelp. Then you get into the bullwhip kelp. And then finally, further out, you get into the giant kelp, the macrocystis. And then in really deep water, you get into what's known as the elk kelp, which have blades that kind of look like elk. Uh, so yeah, so what you would tend to find closer to shoreline, if you were like out in a rocky intertidal area, you'd find more feather boa kelp. Any of the bullwhip kelp or giant kelp that you would find there would have become dislodged from the seafloor and washed ashore. And you will actually see lots of giant kelp, on the coastline in Southern California, where it's been dislodged and washed up ashore. But you won't find really any bullwhip kelp because that tends to be, a little bit further north from Los Angeles. Same with elk kelp. You don't find a lot of that on shore just because you tend to find that more in the colder waters of Northern California. So kelp, like I was saying before, are pretty much only found in cold, temperate water. So like in this picture here, all of this stuff, that's all the top of kelp extending to the surface. And so this makes for some kind of interesting geography in that when you look at kelp forests worldwide, they tend to extend further south on the west coast of the U.S. than on the east coast of the U.S. Right? So let's think about that. Why might that be? And so the map I'll show you in a minute will kind of indicate why. Okay, so a lot of why we have kelp extending further south on the west coast and the east coast has to do with how water moves around. So this map is showing you in green where you find kelp. In blue, it's showing you cold currents, and in red, it's showing you warm currents. So so in the North Pacific, for instance, we have water that's swirling around in a clockwise fashion. So what that means is on our west coast here, because water is swirling around clockwise, that means that the water that we have, like down here in Southern California, is coming from points north, right, where the water is very cold. And so as a result, we have cold water here, which is good for kelp. Whereas if you look on the east coast of the United States, the water that's there is still swirling in a clockwise fashion, but along the east coast, you have water coming from the Caribbean, from warm places up towards it, which is why you only find kelp, in the far northern parts of North America on the Atlantic coastline, whereas it extends pretty far south on the Pacific coast of North America. So one really important thing to kind of notice is where the green is. You tend to not find much green close to the equator, and that's because you don't find kelps growing near the equator because they need cold water. So in general, you find kelps, here, and you find kelps here, whereas like coral reefs, you only tend to find along here, along the equator. Okay, let's talk a little bit about diversity inside of kelp forests. So there's not a tremendous number of species of kelp. There's like a couple dozen kelp species worldwide. However, those kelp have a huge amount of structural diversity, meaning there's a lot of different spaces inside of kelp forests that are really suitable for things to live inside of. As a result, even if there's not many species of kelp, if kelp themselves don't have a lot of species diversity, there is a lot of diversity of species that live inside of kelp forests, right? So there's a lot of diversity of the associated species that live inside of, say, giant kelp or inside of this elk kelp here. Okay, finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about kelp forests and what we know about what are known as trophic cascades from kelp forests. So first, we're going to talk about kelp forests in the West Coast. And we're going to talk about the research that this guy, James Estes, did on these kelp forests. So he was a professor for a long time at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And its kelp forest is where our understanding of trophic cascades come from. And so I'll explain what a trophic cascade is on the next slide. So a trophic cascade describes how what happens at the top of a food web at one of those uppermost trophic levels can have effects that trickle down all the way to the lowest part of the food web. Right, so we have sea otters here on the top, urchins in the middle, and kelp on the bottom. So sea otters eat urchins, and as a result, that has an effect on kelps. So when you have large amounts of sea otters in an area, right, like you see in this picture, you find that sea urchin biomass is very little because sea otters eat tons and tons and tons of urchins. As a result, the grazing intensity, meaning how much of the kelp meaning how much how many urchins there are eating things, so that grazing is much lower. And that will result in there being lots and lots of kelp because they're being protected from those urchins by the sea otters. Urchins are particularly problematic for kelps because urchins will eat the holdfasts of kelp, meaning that once that holdfast goes away, then the kelp becomes dislodged and drifts ashore, and that is no longer living. So that's a trophic cascade. So what is at the very top level of the food web will have effects on things at the very bottom levels of the food web. Even though sea otters don't eat kelp, but they have effects on kelp by them eating sea urchins. So this was kind of the story that was put together by this guy James Estes. But the story actually gets a little bit more complicated than that. So what he found in some of the places that he was studying was that sea otter abundance was actually going down, right? In most places, in general, you find sea otter abundance going up because we're not hunting them anymore. But in this one area, he found that their abundance was going down. So now there's fewer sea otters, which means there's more urchins, which means there's more urchins grazing, which means that there's fewer kelp because the kelp forest is completely overgrazed, so now there's no more kelp there. So why this actually happened is because of killer whales. So why this happened is because of killer whales. So killer whales, are very smart animals, and they will sometimes switch from targeting one prey to another. So what James Estes found was that the orcas were starting to kill and eat otters. And so they were limiting the abundance of those otters, which then had to result in the urchins becoming abundant, which resulted in the kelp, becoming less abundant. So there's actually four levels here, right? So orcas affect otters, otters affect urchins, and urchins affect kelp. So that is the trophic cascade going on here. What you have at the very top, the orcas, has an effect on all the levels below it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about trophic cascades on the east coast of the United States, inside of kelp forests. So in East Coast kelp forests, it's a little bit more complex. So we have Atlantic cod. Atlantic cod eat lobsters, and they also eat urchins. Lobsters also eat urchins, and urchins, as we just learned, eat kelp. So it's not just like this eats that, eats that, eats that. There's this kind of like interesting side bit here where cod are eating both lobsters and urchins, but lobsters are also eating urchins. So the sad thing is that cod abundance on the east coast of the U.S. Has become severely limited over the past few hundred years as people have been catching more and more cod. Right, so now the stocks of cod on the East Coast are incredibly low. Uh, so low, in fact, that in 1990 in Canada there was a moratorium put on catching Atlantic cod, meaning that people are not allowed to catch cod there anymore. They hope that they would recover. The recovery has been very slow, and people are still not allowed to catch Atlantic cod in Canada in the Atlantic Ocean. So cod abundance is very, very low, right? So we're removing this thing from here, right? So what do you think is going to happen when we take the cod out of this scenario? So what you find that's kind of related to that. So this is showing the price per pound of lobster over time. And what you see is it's kind of, it kind of was increasing steadily until the early 2000s, but then you see it starting to plummet over time, right? So why might that be the case? Why is it that the price per pound, the price of lobster is going down? Well, it has to do with economics, right? So probably a lot of you have heard of of supply and demand in terms of economics. And how it essentially works is the more supply there is of an item, the less demand there is. And the less demand there is, the lower the price is. So a perfect example of that is like with gasoline prices. So when there's a lot of production of gasoline worldwide, you tend to see you tend to see lower gas prices. When there's less production of gasoline worldwide, the cost of gas goes up. And it's the same with these lobsters. Essentially, the abundance of lobsters spiked because there wasn't any cod to eat them. And so there became a huge surplus of American lobsters, meaning more supply, less demand, less cost per pound of lobster. So the lobsters have increased in abundance as the cod have decreased. So this is what we would now expect. Without there being any cod, now there would be tons and tons of lobster, which is actually what is found. And you would expect that there would be more urchins because there's no cod to eat the urchins, and you would expect us to have urchin barons. However, this is not actually what is found. It's found that the urchin abundance is actually quite low. And as a result, kelp forests on the East Coast are still doing pretty well. Uh, and so then the question is why? What's going on with this? So essentially, there's two things going on with this, right? So there's lots more lobsters, meaning that that predator is now eating lots of urchin, right? So even though there may be less cod eating the urchin, now there's more lobsters eating them. Another reason for this is uni. So uni is the eggs of urchin. And so people, have started eating more and more uni because there's more urchin available, essentially. So people are eating urchins, particularly people from different countries in Asia are eating more and more urchins. Okay, so that's all I have to tell you about kelp forests. So then in the next chapter, we're going to start to talk about coral reefs.